It happened in the parking lot of a busy supermarket, in broad daylight, with dozens of people walking by. She had just loaded her groceries into the trunk of her car when the officer appeared, his heavy boots crunching on the asphalt, his gaze sharp and filled with something far darker than authority. "Hey! Step away from the vehicle," his voice boomed, loud enough to make heads turn. She froze for a second, unsure if he was even talking to her. "You heard me," he barked again, his hand already resting on the holster at his hip. "Hands where I can see them. Now." Confused and startled, she raised her hands. "What's going on, officer? I haven't done anything wrong." But it didn't matter what she said. To him, her existence was already an offense. "You match the description," he sneered, circling her car. "Suspicious activity. Maybe stolen property. This car doesn't look like something you drive, does it?" Her breath caught in her throat. The disbelief, the anger, and the humiliation all hit at once. This wasn't about suspicion or stolen property. This was about power, his unchecked authority, and the assumptions he had made about her just by looking at her skin. "I can show you my ID," she offered, her voice steady despite the fire building inside her. He didn't care. "Oh, I bet you've got plenty of fake IDs. Turn around, now." People were gathering, some pulling out their phones, others whispering among themselves. But no one stepped in. Not yet. She stood her ground, refusing to turn. "This is harassment," she said, louder this time. "I'm doing nothing wrong." He took a step closer, his face twisted with contempt. "You think you can talk to me like that? Think you're above the law?" And then it happened. A sudden, brutal motion, his boot connecting with her leg, hard and deliberate, knocking her to the ground. Gasps rippled through the onlookers, but he didn't stop. "Stay down," he barked, towering over her. "Or I'll make sure you regret it." But as she looked up at him from the asphalt, something shifted. The pain in her leg was real, but it was nothing compared to the determination burning inside her now. She slowly got up, brushing herself off, her eyes locked onto his. "You have no idea who you're dealing with," she said, her voice calm and cutting like steel. The officer laughed, a cold, hollow sound. "Oh, I know exactly who I'm dealing with." "Now get your, you don't," she interrupted, her tone sharper this time. "But you're about to find out." The murmurs in the crowd grew louder. The cameras were still rolling. And the officer, for the first time, looked uneasy. What happened next would send shockwaves through the entire community. The tables were about to turn in a way no one could have predicted, leaving the officer exposed in ways he never thought possible. What did she mean by those words? And just how far would she go to make him pay for the humiliation he inflicted on her? Stay with us. This is a story you won't forget. To all our black viewers watching this story, we want you to know that here at Plow of Twist, we stand firmly against racism in any form. This channel is a space where everyone is respected, valued, and celebrated. Racism and injustice have no place here or anywhere else in the world. Thank you for being part of our community, and if you haven't already, make sure to subscribe to the channel and hit that like button. Now, sit back and enjoy this powerful story. Let's dive in. The morning had started like any other for Tasha Miller. She was the kind of woman whose presence commanded attention, though she rarely sought it. Her sharp eyes carried a quiet determination, and her voice, when she spoke, was steady and measured. But today, she had no intention of making waves. It was her day off, and all she wanted was to cross a few errands off her list and enjoy a rare moment of peace. Tasha lived in a modest but well-kept apartment complex on the outskirts of the city. The neighborhood wasn't luxurious, but it had character, families playing in small front yards, elderly couples tending to their gardens, and the faint aroma of home-cooked meals drifting through the air. It was a place she had come to love, despite its flaws. She had moved there 5 years ago, needing a fresh start after leaving behind a more chaotic chapter of her life in Chicago. She had her reasons for choosing this quieter city. The slower pace suited her, and it was far enough from her old life that she could focus on herself. By day, Tasha worked as a customer service representative at a tech firm, a job that paid the bills but didn't particularly excite her. What kept her going was the sense of structure it gave her. What most people didn't know was that this calm, methodical exterior masked years of grit, resilience, and a history far more complex than anyone could guess. That morning, Tasha had woken up early, brewed her coffee, and jotted down her to-do list in the little notebook she kept on the kitchen counter. She needed groceries, a new phone charger, and a set of batteries for the TV remote. Simple tasks. Tasks that felt safe, routine, ordinary. As she slipped on her sneakers and grabbed her car keys, she gave herself a little smile in the mirror. Just another day, she thought. The grocery store was bustling with weekend shoppers, carts filled with bulk snacks and bottles of soda, kids tugging at their parents' hands for cereal boxes with cartoon characters on the front. Tasha moved efficiently through the aisles, her list tucked into the side pocket of her bag. She was the type to plan her shopping trip like a mission, no lingering, no distractions, just get what's needed and get out. By the time she reached the checkout line, her cart was neatly packed with produce, household essentials, and a few indulgences like her favorite brand of dark chocolate. Across the parking lot, Officer Brad Donovan sat in his patrol car, sipping from a disposable coffee cup and tapping idly on his steering wheel. To anyone else, it might have seemed like he was just another cop on a routine patrol, but those who knew him, or, more accurately, those who had crossed paths with him, would describe him differently. Donovan had built a reputation in the precinct and on the streets. He was the kind of officer who interpreted "serve and protect" as a license to dominate and intimidate. Brad wasn't always like this. In his earlier years on the force, he had been eager and idealistic, joining the police academy straight out of high school with a belief that he could make a difference. But over time, disillusionment set in. The constant pressure, the lack of accountability among his peers, and his own unchecked biases warped his sense of duty. Now, his uniform had become less a symbol of service and more a weapon he wielded to assert control. As he scanned the parking lot from his car, his eyes landed on Tasha loading her groceries into the trunk of her silver sedan. To him, it was just another routine moment, a split-second judgment based entirely on what he thought he saw. The expensive-looking car, the confident posture of the woman. In his mind, they didn't fit together. Something about it irritated him, stoking a fire he barely understood but had stopped questioning long ago. He crumpled his coffee cup and tossed it onto the passenger seat, stepping out of the car with a deliberate swagger. Meanwhile, Tasha had just finished loading the last bag into her trunk. She closed it with a satisfying thunk and turned to unlock the driver's side door. That's when she heard the voice. "Hey! You! Step away from the vehicle." The words came sharp and loud, cutting through the din of the parking lot. Tasha turned, startled, and saw the officer approaching. For a moment, she thought there must be some mistake. Surely he wasn't talking to her. But the look in his eyes told her otherwise. "Excuse me," she said, her voice steady but tinged with confusion. "I said step away from the car," he repeated, his hand resting on the holster at his hip. "Now." Tasha's heart began to race, but she forced herself to stay calm. She'd been in situations like this before, not exactly like this, but close enough to recognize the danger. She raised her hands slightly, palms facing out, a gesture meant to diffuse the tension. "Officer, there's no need for alarm. This is my car. I just finished grocery shopping." Donovan's eyes narrowed. "Looks like you're driving something a little too fancy for groceries," he said, circling the vehicle. "How'd you come by this car? You got papers for it?" Tasha felt a wave of indignation rise in her chest, but she kept her expression neutral. "Of course I have papers. It's registered in my name." "Is that so?" Donovan stopped in front of her, his posture towering and confrontational. Then why don't you go ahead and prove it? Right here, right now. The parking lot grew quieter. People nearby were starting to notice. A few slowed their steps, glancing at the scene with a mix of curiosity and unease. Tasha glanced around, her cheeks burning with humiliation. She could feel the weight of their stares, the judgment in their silence. I don't understand what's happening here, Tasha said finally, her voice firmer now. I haven't done anything wrong. Oh, I think you know exactly what's happening, Donovan sneered. He took another step closer. You think you're above the law? Driving around in a car like this, pretending like you belong? Tasha took a deep breath, steadying herself. I'm not pretending anything. This is harassment. The word seemed to ignite something in Donovan. His jaw tightened, and his hand twitched at his side. You want to talk harassment, he said, his voice dropping to a dangerous low. You haven't seen harassment. Now turn around, hands on the hood. Tasha didn't move. No, the single word hung in the air like a challenge. A murmur rippled through the small crowd that had gathered, phones raised, recording. Tasha saw their faces, some shocked, some hesitant, none willing to intervene. She felt utterly alone, but she refused to let that show. Donovan's face darkened. You don't give the orders here. I do. Before she could react, he raised his boot and kicked, hard and fast, catching her in the leg and sending her sprawling to the ground. Gasps echoed through the parking lot. The pain shot through her knee, sharp and searing, but Tasha refused to cry out. She gritted her teeth, staring up at Donovan with a defiance that made his smirk falter. He had expected submission. Instead, he saw fire. Stay down, he barked. Don't make this harder on yourself. But as Tasha pulled herself up from the ground, one slow, deliberate motion at a time, her eyes locked onto his, unflinching. You've just made the biggest mistake of your life, she said, her voice cold and unyielding. The onlookers leaned closer, their cameras still rolling, capturing every second. They had no idea what was coming next, but neither did he. The atmosphere in the parking lot had shifted. The tension lingered in the air, thick and suffocating, as Tasha stood her ground, her leg throbbing but her resolve unshaken. Donovan hadn't expected her to get back up, let alone stare him down. The murmurs in the growing crowd grew louder, and the soft hum of recording phones reminded him he was being watched. But that only seemed to stoke his arrogance further. All right, we're done playing games, Donovan snapped, stepping closer. You're under arrest. Turn around and put your hands behind your back. For what? Tasha's voice was sharp, her tone cutting through the noise like a blade. She wasn't yelling, she didn't need to. Every word she spoke was laced with controlled fury. You can't just arrest me because you feel like it. What's the charge? Resisting an officer, he said quickly, his words dripping with disdain. And maybe assault. You've been pretty mouthy. Tasha almost laughed at the absurdity, though her hands clenched into fists. Assault, she repeated. You kicked me. You were threatening me, Donovan shot back without missing a beat. I acted within my authority to ensure the safety of this parking lot. Now turn around, before I make you. The words were chilling, spoken with the kind of casual cruelty that only someone accustomed to abusing power could muster. But Tasha didn't flinch. Instead, she glanced toward the crowd, her eyes scanning the faces watching everything unfold. You're all just going to stand there, she called out, her voice louder now, cutting through the static shock of the moment. You're seeing this. You're recording this. Do something. A few people shifted uneasily, their eyes darting between Tasha and Donovan. One man, holding his phone up, muttered, We're recording. This will go viral. People will see. But no one moved. No one intervened. Donovan smirked, as if their inaction was a victory in itself. See that? They're smarter than you. Now, last chance, hands behind your back. Tasha didn't comply. She simply stood there, her gaze unwavering. You're going to regret this, she said softly, almost to herself, but loud enough for him to hear. You think so? Donovan's smirk widened. He reached for his cuffs, the metallic clink sending a shiver through the crowd. Before he could grab her wrist, the sound of an approaching engine broke through the tension. A sleek black SUV pulled into the parking lot, its tinted windows reflecting the chaotic scene. It stopped abruptly, the door swinging open. Out stepped a man in a dark suit, his face unreadable behind aviator sunglasses. Officer Donovan, the man called, his voice firm and commanding. He flashed a badge, an unmistakable gold and blue insignia that made the murmurs in the crowd grow louder. Step back. Donovan hesitated, his confidence faltering for the first time. Who the hell are you? Federal Agent Marcus Barnes, FBI. The man's tone left no room for argument. You've already crossed a line here. Don't make it worse. Donovan scoffed, but there was an edge of uncertainty in his laugh. FBI? For what? This is a local matter. You have no jurisdiction here. Barnes stepped closer, his expression cold and unyielding. This is no longer a local matter. Step away from the woman. Now. The crowd seemed to collectively hold its breath. Donovan's jaw tightened, his hand still hovering near Tasha. But she stood perfectly still, her eyes flicking between Donovan and Barnes. She said nothing, but the hint of a smirk tugged at the corner of her lips. You don't get to just barge in here and tell me how to do my job, Donovan snapped, though his voice lacked its earlier conviction. Barnes raised an eyebrow, his demeanor calm but lethal. From what I've seen, you haven't been doing your job. You've been abusing it. We'll deal with that soon enough. He gestured toward the onlookers. Plenty of witnesses here. Plenty of footage. You're already in trouble, officer. Donovan's confidence cracked, but he wasn't ready to back down completely. She's not innocent, he insisted, pointing at Tasha. She's been resisting me from the start. Barnes tilted his head, studying Donovan like a predator sizing up its prey. I've worked long enough to recognize when someone's resisting arrest and when someone's resisting harassment, he said. And trust me, you're in the latter category. The officer opened his mouth to respond, but before he could, Tasha finally spoke. It's over, she said, her voice low but steady. Donovan turned to her, his face twisting in frustration. You think you've won, huh? Think this guy's going to save you? No, Tasha replied, her eyes boring into his. I'm going to save myself. The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning, but neither Donovan nor Barnes seemed fully prepared for what came next. Tasha reached into her back pocket, pulling out a sleek black wallet. She flipped it open, revealing a badge identical to the one Barnes had shown just moments earlier. The parking lot erupted into chaos, gasps, murmurs, and the frantic sound of camera shutters clicking. Donovan's face went pale, his bravado evaporating in an instant. You're FBI? He stammered, his voice barely above a whisper. Tasha didn't answer immediately. She let the moment sink in, let him feel the weight of the situation. Special Agent Tasha Miller, she said finally, her tone colder than ice. And you just made a very, very big mistake. Barnes crossed his arms, his expression unreadable but clearly unimpressed with Donovan. You really should have listened, he said dryly. Donovan stumbled back a step, his hand dropping away from his holster. I didn't know, he stuttered. She didn't what? Tasha cut him off sharply. Look like someone who deserved basic respect. Or did you think your badge gave you the right to act like judge, jury, and executioner? The crowd was silent now, their phones capturing every word, every shift in expression. This isn't what it looks like, Donovan muttered, his voice weak and desperate. Oh, it's exactly what it looks like, Tasha snapped. She stepped closer to him, her presence commanding, her voice steady. And it's all on camera. Barnes held up a hand, silencing the officer before he could dig himself any deeper. This is going to the Bureau's Internal Affairs Division, he said. And trust me, Officer Donovan, they don't take cases like this lightly. Donovan opened his mouth to respond, but the sound of another approaching vehicle cut him off. This time, it was a marked police car, its lights flashing as it pulled up beside the scene. Two uniformed officers stepped out, their expressions a mix of confusion and concern. Barnes turned to them, nodding. "Take him in," he said simply. The officers hesitated, glancing at Donovan. "For what?" one of them asked. "For everything you just witnessed," Barnes replied. He turned to Tasha, his gaze softening slightly. "You good?" Tasha nodded, though the fire in her eyes hadn't dimmed. "I'm fine," she said. But her tone suggested she wasn't done yet, not by a long shot. As Donovan was reluctantly cuffed and led to the police car, the crowd erupted into murmurs once again. Some cheered, others whispered, but all eyes remained on Tasha as she stood tall, watching the officer who had tried to humiliate her being escorted away in shame. But this wasn't the end. Not for Donovan. And certainly not for Tasha. There was still more to uncover, more justice to be served. And the next move? That was entirely hers. The air in the room was suffocating, thick with tension that no one dared to cut. Tasha stood near the head of the long table in the conference room of the FBI's field office. The walls, painted a dull gray, seemed to close in as the weight of the situation bore down on everyone present. Across from her sat Brad Donovan, his face pale, his hands clasped tightly in front of him on the table. He didn't look like the overconfident officer from the parking lot anymore. Stripped of his badge, his uniform, and, most importantly, his sense of control, he now seemed small and out of place, like a man who knew the floor beneath him could crumble at any moment. To his left, his lawyer, a stern-faced woman in a dark suit, whispered something into his ear. But Donovan wasn't listening. His eyes were fixed on Tasha, a mix of anger, fear, and confusion swirling in his expression. Tasha hadn't said much yet. She didn't need to. The silence was deliberate, her way of making him stew in the discomfort. Her gaze was steady, unblinking, and it unnerved him more than anything she could have said. Finally, Donovan broke the silence. His voice was hoarse, unsteady. This is ridiculous," he muttered, looking around the room as though searching for someone to back him up. "I didn't do anything wrong." Tasha raised an eyebrow, her expression cold. "Didn't do anything wrong," she repeated, her tone calm but biting. She leaned forward slightly, placing her hands on the table. "You assaulted me in broad daylight. You humiliated me in front of a crowd of people. You abused your authority to satisfy your own prejudices. And you think you didn't do anything wrong?" Donovan's lawyer placed a hand on his arm, trying to restrain him, but he shrugged her off. "I didn't know who you were," he snapped, his voice rising. "And that makes it okay?" Tasha's voice didn't rise to match his. It didn't need to. The calm, razor-sharp edge in her tone was more powerful than any shout. I didn't mean," Donovan stammered, but Tasha cut him off. "You didn't mean what? To expose yourself as a bully? To show everyone who you really are when you think no one's watching?" She leaned back, crossing her arms. "No, Officer Donovan, you meant every single thing you did. You just didn't expect to face the consequences." Donovan's jaw tightened, his fists clenching on the table. "This is a setup," he said finally, though the conviction in his voice was faltering. You planned this, didn't you? You were looking for a reason to go after me." Tasha's laugh was humorless, a sharp, cutting sound that echoed in the room. "You think you're that important?" she asked, tilting her head. "You think I planned for you to assault me, in front of witnesses, on camera?" "No, Officer Donovan. You did that all on your own. I just happened to be the wrong person for you to target. Donovan's lawyer tried again to intervene. Agent Miller, let's not let emotions get the better of us here. This isn't about emotions, Tasha interrupted, her voice firm. This is about accountability. Something your client has spent his career avoiding. The lawyer opened her mouth to respond, but Tasha wasn't done. She turned her attention back to Donovan. Do you have any idea how many complaints have been filed against you? She asked, her tone icy. Donovan's eyes widened slightly, though he quickly masked it with defiance. That's irrelevant, he said through gritted teeth. Oh, it's very relevant, Tasha shot back. She slid a thick file across the table toward him. You've been accused of misconduct at least a dozen times in the past 5 years. Excessive force, racial profiling, harassment. The department buried most of it, of course. But we've been digging it up. Donovan glanced at the file but didn't touch it. His lawyer picked it up instead, flipping through the pages. Her frown deepened with every line she read. This doesn't prove anything, Donovan said weakly. It proves a pattern, Tasha countered. A pattern of abuse, of discrimination, of thinking you're above the law. But let me tell you something, Officer Donovan. No one is above the law. Not even you. Donovan's lawyer cleared her throat, trying to regain control of the situation. Agent Miller, if your intention here is to intimidate my client, I suggest we end this meeting and take it to court. Oh, we'll get to court, Tasha said smoothly. But before we do, let me make one thing clear. This isn't just about me. This is about every person you've hurt, every life you've disrupted because you thought your badge gave you the right to treat people like they were less than human. She leaned forward again, her eyes locking onto Donovan's. And I'm going to make sure every single one of them gets justice. Donovan swallowed hard, his bravado crumbling. You can't do this, he said, almost pleading. You can't ruin my life over one mistake. One mistake? Tasha repeated, her voice rising slightly for the first time. You think this was just one mistake? This wasn't a lapse in judgment. This is who you are. And now, the world is going to see it. The tension in the room was palpable, the silence that followed her words heavy with unspoken truths. For a moment, no one spoke. Then, Agent Barnes stepped into the room, his presence as commanding as ever. He glanced at Tasha, then at Donovan. It's time, he said simply. Tasha nodded, straightening up. She turned to Donovan one last time. You asked earlier if I planned this, she said. The answer is no. But I am going to finish it. With that, she walked out of the room, leaving Donovan alone with his lawyer and the weight of his crumbling world. Outside, the hallways of the FBI field office buzzed with activity. Agents moved quickly, files and phones in hand, their faces focused and determined. But as Tasha walked past, they all seemed to pause for a moment, their eyes following her with a mixture of respect and awe. Barnes caught up with her as she headed toward her office. You handled that well, he said. Tasha gave him a small, tired smile. It's not over yet. No, Barnes agreed. But you've made it clear it's not going to end well for him. She didn't respond, her mind already racing with the next steps. There was still so much to do, so many pieces to put in place. But for the first time since the incident in the parking lot, she felt a glimmer of satisfaction. Justice was finally within reach, and she wasn't going to stop until it was served. As she reached her office, she paused, glancing back at Barnes. Make sure the media gets the footage, she said. The whole thing. Barnes nodded. Already in motion. Tasha stepped into her office, closing the door behind her. She exhaled deeply, leaning against the door for a moment. The fight wasn't over, but for the first time, she felt like she was winning. The room buzzed with tension as the press conference was set to begin. Cameras lined the back of the room, reporters jostling for position, their notebooks and recorders ready to capture every word. The footage from the parking lot had already gone viral, sparking outrage across social media and making headlines on every major news outlet. Now, the FBI had called this meeting to address the situation publicly, a rare move, but one that felt necessary given the gravity of the case. Tasha stood off to the side, her arms crossed, watching the crowd through the one-way glass of an adjoining room. She could see the curiosity on their faces, the eagerness to hear her side of the story, to know what would happen next. But she wasn't here to entertain them. This was about justice. About accountability. About something much bigger than her. Agent Marcus Barnes entered the room behind her, closing the doors softly. "They're ready for you," he said. Tasha didn't respond immediately. Her eyes remained fixed on the crowd. "Do you think they'll actually care about what happens after today?" she asked finally, her voice quiet but steady. "Or will this just be another headline they forget in a week?" Barnes stepped closer, his tone reassuring. "They'll care. You've already made them care. People are paying attention, and that's more than most cases like this ever get." Tasha nodded, but her expression remained guarded. "It's not just about him," she said. "This isn't just one bad cop. It's a system that let him get away with it for years. And now you have the power to hold that system accountable," Barnes replied. "One step at a time." Tasha turned to him, her gaze intense. "This step better count." "It will," Barnes said. "But only if you're ready." She took a deep breath, straightened her blazer, and nodded. "Let's do this." As she stepped into the conference room, the noise immediately quieted. All eyes turned to her, the cameras zooming in, the reporters leaning forward in their chairs. She approached the podium with deliberate steps, her face calm and composed, though her heart was pounding in her chest. "Good afternoon," she began, her voice clear and firm. "My name is Special Agent Tasha Miller, and I am here today not just as a representative of the FBI but as someone who has experienced firsthand the abuse of power by someone sworn to protect the public." The room remained silent, hanging on her every word. "Last week," she continued, "I was the victim of an unprovoked assault by Officer Brad Donovan, a man who used his badge not to serve or protect but to intimidate and harm. What you saw in the footage was not an isolated incident. It was the result of years of unchecked behavior, enabled by a system that prioritizes loyalty over accountability." She paused, letting the weight of her words settle over the room. "For too long, individuals like Officer Donovan have operated without fear of consequences," she said. "They've relied on the silence of their colleagues, the inaction of their superiors, and the apathy of the public. But today, that silence ends." A murmur rippled through the crowd, but Tasha pressed on. "This is not just about one man," she said. "It's about a culture that allows prejudice and abuse to thrive within our institutions. It's about the countless victims who never had the chance to speak up, who never saw justice. And it's about ensuring that no one else has to endure what I and so many others have endured." She stepped back from the podium slightly, her eyes scanning the room. "Officer Donovan will face the full weight of the law for his actions," she continued. "But this isn't just about punishment. It's about change. Real, systemic change." A reporter in the front row raised her hand. Tasha pointed to her. "Agent Miller, how do you respond to those who say you provoked the incident?" Tasha's jaw tightened, but she kept her composure. "Provoked?" she repeated. "By existing? By standing in a parking lot, loading my groceries into my car? Let me be clear, nothing I did justified what happened to me. And the fact that anyone would even ask that question shows exactly why we need to have this conversation." Another hand shot up. "Agent Miller, are you concerned about backlash from law enforcement communities?" Tasha hesitated for a moment before answering. "I'm not here to make friends," she said bluntly. "I'm here to make sure justice is served. If that makes some people uncomfortable, so be it." Change doesn't come without discomfort. Barnes, standing in the back of the room, gave her a subtle nod of approval. She was doing exactly what needed to be done. As the questions continued, Tasha answered each one with precision and poise, never allowing herself to be rattled. She spoke not just for herself but for every person who had been silenced, every victim who had been dismissed, every community that had suffered under the weight of systemic injustice. By the time the conference ended, the room was buzzing with energy. Reporters rushed to file their stories, their headlines already forming in their minds. But for Tasha, this wasn't about headlines. It was about the work that still needed to be done. Back in her office, she sank into her chair, exhaustion finally catching up with her. Barnes entered a moment later, a small smile on his face. "You did good," he said. "It's a start," she replied, rubbing her temples. "But it's not enough." "It's never enough," Barnes said. "But it's more than most people manage in a lifetime." Tasha looked up at him, her expression softening slightly. "Thanks, Marcus. For having my back." "Always," he said simply. The door to her office opened again, and another agent stepped in, holding a thick file. "Agent Miller, you need to see this," he said, his tone urgent. Tasha took the file, her brows furrowing as she opened it. Her eyes scanned the pages, and her expression hardened. "What is it?" Barnes asked. "It's worse than we thought," Tasha said, her voice low. She handed the file to Barnes, who skimmed through it, his jaw tightening. "This isn't just about Donovan," he said, his tone grim. "It's the whole department." Tasha nodded. "And now we have the proof." The room was silent for a moment as they both processed the implications. Then Tasha stood, her determination renewed. "This isn't over," she said. "Not by a long shot." And as she walked out of the office, the file clutched tightly in her hand, she knew one thing for certain: the fight for justice had only just begun. The atmosphere in the FBI's conference room was heavy, charged with the energy of revelation and the undeniable weight of responsibility. The file Tasha held in her hands wasn't just evidence, it was a Pandora's box. The pages detailed a long-standing pattern of abuse, corruption, and cover-ups within the local police department. Brad Donovan wasn't an outlier, he was a symptom of a larger, systemic disease. Tasha paced the room, her thoughts racing. Every line of the report burned into her mind: officers falsifying reports, targeting minority communities, silencing complaints with threats or bribes. The more she read, the clearer it became that this wasn't going to be a simple investigation. This was a reckoning. Agent Marcus Barnes sat in the corner, leaning back in his chair with a grim expression. "You realize what this means, don't you?" he asked. His voice was calm, but there was a gravity to it that underscored the stakes. Tasha stopped pacing, looking up at him. "It means we can't stop at Donovan," she said firmly. "We have to take the whole system apart." Barnes nodded slowly. "But you also know what happens when we take this public. These aren't just individual bad actors. It's the department. The city. There are going to be people, powerful people, who will do everything in their power to shut this down." Tasha crossed her arms, her gaze unyielding. "Let them try. We've got enough evidence to make this stick." Barnes hesitated, his eyes narrowing. "But how far are you willing to go, Tasha? This isn't just a case. It's a fight that could follow you for the rest of your career, hell, the rest of your life." She stared at him for a long moment, the weight of his words settling over her. "I don't care," she said finally. "If we don't do this, who will?" Barnes let out a low sigh, rubbing the back of his neck. "All right," he said. "Then we start with the department. Internal affairs. Bring them in, and let the chips fall where they may." The next morning, the FBI task force convened in a secured briefing room. Tasha stood at the front, presenting the findings to a group of agents, federal attorneys, and key members of the Bureau's leadership. The room was silent as she outlined the scope of the corruption, the names of officers implicated, and the communities that had suffered under their unchecked power. The faces around the table ranged from shock to grim determination. When she finished, a senior agent leaned forward, his fingers steepled under his chin. "This is big," he said. "Bigger than I think any of us realized. And that's why we need to move fast," Tasha replied. "If word gets out before we're ready, they'll bury this. Evidence will disappear. Witnesses will be intimidated. We can't give them that chance." Another agent spoke up, his tone cautious. "But if we go after the department as a whole, we're going to need local cooperation. This isn't just a federal case. It's going to affect the city, the state. Politicians will get involved. Are we ready for that?" Tasha's jaw tightened. "We don't have a choice. This isn't just about justice for me or the people who've already suffered. It's about preventing this from happening again." Barnes, seated near the back, chimed in. "She's right. If we let fear dictate our actions, we're no better than the people we're trying to hold accountable." The senior agent nodded slowly. "All right. Let's move forward. But we're going to need airtight evidence and a coordinated strategy. No leaks, no mistakes." For the next week, the task force worked around the clock. Tasha led interviews with witnesses and victims, many of whom were hesitant to come forward. She spent hours earning their trust, listening to their stories, and promising them protection. Each account added another layer to the case: a mother who had been falsely accused of theft, a teenager who had been assaulted during a routine traffic stop, a shop owner whose business had been targeted for harassment after he refused to pay off-duty officers for security services. Meanwhile, Barnes and a team of agents focused on securing internal documents from the department. Records of complaints that had been dismissed, emails between officers coordinating cover-ups, financial transactions that hinted at bribery and extortion. Every piece of evidence brought them closer to the truth, and closer to the point of no return. But as the case grew, so did the resistance. Tasha began receiving anonymous threats, letters slipped under her office door, emails warning her to back off, phone calls that ended in silence. One night, as she left the field office, she noticed a black SUV parked across the street. Its windows were tinted, and it didn't follow her, but its presence was enough to set her on edge. Barnes noticed her unease the next morning. "They're trying to scare you," he said. "Don't let them." "I'm not scared," Tasha replied, though the exhaustion in her eyes betrayed her. "I'm angry." As the pressure mounted, so did the moral complexity of the case. Not every officer in the department was corrupt, some were genuinely trying to do their jobs, caught in a system that punished integrity and rewarded silence. Tasha found herself wrestling with how to navigate those gray areas. Was it fair to tarnish the entire department for the sins of a few? Or was that the only way to force real change? One evening, while reviewing the case files in her apartment, she received a call from an unknown number. She hesitated before answering, her voice cautious. "Hello." "Agent Miller," a male voice said. It was calm, measured, and unfamiliar. "You're making waves. Big ones." "Who is this?" she asked, her grip tightening on the phone. "Someone who knows how the game is played," the voice replied. "And I'm telling you, you're in over your head. Drop the case. Walk away. No one will blame you." Tasha's jaw clenched. "Is that a threat?" "It's advice," the voice said. "The people you're going after, they're not just going to roll over. They'll fight back. And they'll make sure you regret it." "Let them try," Tasha said, her voice hardening. "I've dealt with worse." There was a pause on the other end of the line. Then, the voice said, "You're going to wish you'd listened." The line went dead. Tasha stared at her phone, her heart pounding. But instead of fear, she felt a surge of resolve. She wasn't going to back down. Not now. Not ever. The next day, the task force finalized their plan. They would serve warrants on key members of the department, seize documents and equipment, and make arrests where necessary. It was a coordinated effort designed to minimize the chance of retaliation or interference. As Tasha prepared for the operation, she couldn't shake the feeling that something big was coming. She didn't know what it was, but she knew one thing for sure: she was ready. The fight wasn't over. It was just beginning. And no matter how many obstacles stood in her way, Tasha Miller wasn't going to stop until justice was served. The morning of the operation arrived with a chill in the air, the kind that seemed to settle in the bones. The FBI's field office was a hive of activity as agents prepared for one of the largest internal corruption stings the Bureau had ever coordinated. The tension was palpable, every movement purposeful, every conversation clipped and focused. Tasha stood at the center of it all, her face unreadable as she reviewed the final details of the plan. The task force had meticulously mapped out their approach, and now it was time to execute. The weight of the moment wasn't lost on her. This was about more than just Brad Donovan or even the corrupt department he represented. It was about proving that accountability was possible, even when it came to institutions as entrenched as law enforcement. Agent Marcus Barnes approached her, his expression serious but calm. "We're set," he said. "All units are in position. The warrants have been signed. We just need your go-ahead." Tasha nodded, exhaling slowly. "Let's move," she said, her voice steady. "And make sure everyone sticks to protocol. No slip-ups." Barnes gave her a small nod of reassurance. "We've got this." The operation began like clockwork. Teams of agents moved on predetermined targets, serving warrants and seizing evidence. The local police department, once a fortress of unchecked authority, was now a flurry of activity as FBI agents combed through offices, confiscating documents, hard drives, and other records. Officers who had grown complacent in their impunity now sat in stunned silence as the reality of the situation sank in. Tasha arrived at the station mid-morning, her presence immediately commanding attention. She wasn't there for theatrics, she had a specific purpose. Brad Donovan. She found him in one of the holding rooms, seated at a metal table with his hands cuffed in front of him. His lawyer was at his side, her face a mask of barely concealed frustration. Tasha stepped into the room, closing the door behind her. Barnes stood just outside, his presence a quiet but reassuring reminder that she wasn't alone in this. Donovan looked up as she entered, his expression a mix of anger and defiance. "So, this is how it ends," he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "The big, bad FBI swoops in and saves the day." Tasha didn't rise to the bait. She pulled out a chair and sat across from him, placing a thick file on the table between them. "You had plenty of chances to stop this, Donovan," she said evenly. "Plenty of opportunities to do the right thing. But you didn't. And now you're going to answer for it." He smirked, leaning back in his chair. "Answer for what?" "For doing my job. For trying to keep the streets safe." Tasha opened the file, pulling out a series of documents and laying them in front of him. "For this," she said, her voice hard. "Falsified reports. Excessive force complaints. Evidence of racial profiling. And that's just the beginning." Donovan's smirk faltered, but he quickly recovered. "You think a bunch of papers are going to take me down? You think anyone's going to believe your version of the story over mine?" Tasha met his gaze, unflinching. "It's not just my version," she said. "It's the version backed up by dozens of witnesses, hours of footage, and years of evidence. You built your career on fear and intimidation, Donovan. But fear only works when no one's willing to stand up to you." His lawyer interjected, her tone sharp. "Agent Miller, if this is some kind of intimidation tactic, I'll remind you that my client is entitled to due process." "This isn't intimidation," Tasha said, her eyes never leaving Donovan's. "This is accountability. Something your client has spent his entire career avoiding. Donovan leaned forward, his cuffs clinking against the metal table. You think you're so righteous, don't you? He said, his voice low and venomous. Like you're some kind of hero. But you're just like me. You use your badge to get what you want. The only difference is, you're better at hiding it. Tasha's jaw tightened, but she didn't let his words rattle her. The difference, she said firmly, is that I hold myself to the same standard I hold others. Something you've never done. The room fell silent, the weight of her words hanging in the air. Donovan's lawyer shifted uncomfortably, clearly aware that her client wasn't doing himself any favors. Finally, she spoke. If you're not here to negotiate, Agent Miller, I suggest we end this conversation. Tasha stood, gathering the documents and sliding them back into the file. Negotiation isn't on the table, she said. Your client had his chance to cooperate. Now he'll face the consequences. As she turned to leave, Donovan called after her. You think this ends with me? He said, his voice rising. You think taking me down is going to fix anything? You're delusional. Tasha paused at the door, looking back at him. You're right, she said. This doesn't end with you. But it starts with you. And that's enough. She stepped out into the hallway, closing the door behind her. Barnes was waiting, his expression a mix of approval and concern. How'd it go? He asked. Tasha shook her head. He's not going to cooperate. He's too arrogant to admit he's wrong. Barnes sighed. That's not surprising. But we don't need his cooperation. We've got everything we need. Do we? Tasha asked, her voice quiet. Because if we don't get this right, if even one piece of this falls apart, it's not just Donovan who walks away. It's everyone. Barnes placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. We're not going to let that happen. We've worked too hard, and we've got too much on our side. Trust the process. Tasha nodded, though the weight of responsibility still pressed heavily on her. Let's get this done, she said. No mistakes. The rest of the day was a blur of activity as the task force continued their work. More officers were brought in for questioning, more evidence was catalogued and secured. The scope of the corruption became clearer with each passing hour, and so did the enormity of the task ahead. By the time Tasha finally left the field office that night, she was physically and emotionally drained. She sat in her car for a long moment, staring at the dashboard, her mind racing with thoughts of what still needed to be done. But despite the exhaustion, she felt a flicker of hope. For the first time, it felt like real change was possible. As she drove home, her phone buzzed with a text from Barnes. Good work today. We're getting there. Tasha allowed herself a small smile. One step at a time, she replied. The fight was far from over, but for the first time, she felt like they were winning. And that was enough to keep her going. For now. The corridors of the courthouse were lined with tension as Tasha made her way toward the hearing room. The culmination of months of work, sleepless nights, and unrelenting focus now rested on the outcome of today's proceedings. This wasn't just about Brad Donovan anymore. This was about a broken system being brought into the light, with consequences reverberating far beyond the man who had sparked it all. Inside the room, the atmosphere was thick with anticipation. Rows of benches were packed with reporters, community members, and colleagues. The judge sat elevated behind a polished wooden bench, her sharp eyes surveying the room with an air of authority. At the front table, Donovan sat next to his lawyer, his posture rigid, his expression a mask of defiance. Tasha entered the room quietly, slipping into her seat with Agent Marcus Barnes beside her. You ready for this? Barnes asked in a low voice, his eyes scanning the room. I don't think anyone's ever really ready for something like this, Tasha replied. But I'll do what needs to be done. The proceedings began with the crisp bang of the judge's gavel. The prosecution opened with a scathing account of Donovan's actions, presenting a timeline of incidents supported by evidence gathered during the investigation. One by one, witnesses were called to the stand, people whose lives had been upended by the culture of corruption Donovan had embodied. A shopkeeper spoke of years of harassment and intimidation. A young man described an unprovoked traffic stop that ended in violence. Their voices were steady but filled with the weight of lived trauma, each testimony another brick in the wall that was closing in on Donovan. Tasha watched his reaction carefully. He shifted in his seat, his fingers tapping restlessly on the table. His lawyer leaned in occasionally, whispering advice, but Donovan's expression remained a blend of anger and disbelief. It was clear that he hadn't expected things to go this far, that the world he had operated in for years without consequence was now crumbling around him. When it was finally Tasha's turn to testify, she felt the weight of every eye in the room as she approached the stand. Taking her oath, she sat down, her back straight, her hands folded neatly in her lap. The prosecution began with straightforward questions about the incident in the parking lot, allowing Tasha to recount what had happened in her own words. Her tone was measured, her voice steady, but there was no mistaking the emotion beneath her calm exterior. When Officer Donovan approached you, the prosecutor asked, what was your initial reaction? I was confused, Tasha said. I didn't understand why he was targeting me. I hadn't done anything wrong. And when he escalated the situation? Tasha paused, her jaw tightening slightly. I felt powerless, she admitted. But I also felt angry. Angry that someone could use their authority to humiliate and harm someone simply because they thought they could get away with it. The prosecutor nodded, stepping closer. You later revealed your position as a federal agent. Why did you choose not to do so earlier in the encounter? I wanted to see how far he would go, Tasha replied. I needed to know if this was about enforcing the law or about abusing power. The defense attorney stood next, her expression sharp. She wasted no time launching into a pointed line of questioning. Agent Miller, you say you felt powerless during this encounter, but isn't it true that you were in a position of power the entire time? After all, you're an FBI agent. Tasha met the lawyer's gaze without flinching. My position doesn't erase what happened, she said. When I was on the ground, after being kicked, my badge didn't protect me. My authority didn't matter. To him, I was just another person he thought he could dominate. And yet, the attorney continued, you chose to escalate the situation by refusing his commands. Tasha's voice sharpened slightly. I refuse to comply with unlawful commands. There's a difference. The back and forth continued, each question designed to paint Tasha as complicit in the encounter, but she held her ground. Her answers were firm, her demeanor unshakable. By the time she stepped down from the stand, the room was buzzing with quiet murmurs. She returned to her seat beside Barnes, who gave her a subtle nod of approval. The next hours passed in a blur of testimonies, evidence presentations, and heated arguments. But as the day wore on, it became clear that the case against Donovan was airtight. The evidence was overwhelming, the witnesses compelling. Even the defense attorney seemed to falter under the weight of it all, her objections growing weaker and less frequent. Finally, the closing arguments began. The prosecutor's words were precise and cutting, a final hammer strike against Donovan's crumbling defenses. This is not just about one officer, she said, her voice ringing through the room. This is about a culture of impunity that has gone unchecked for far too long. Officer Donovan's actions are a symptom of a much larger problem, but holding him accountable is the first step toward meaningful change. Donovan's attorney countered with an appeal to the gray areas of law enforcement, arguing that split-second decisions and high-pressure situations often led to misunderstandings. But the argument felt hollow, especially in the face of the overwhelming evidence presented. As the judge called for a recess to deliberate, the room erupted into quiet chatter. Tasha remained seated, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. Barnes leaned toward her. We've got this, he said quietly. They can't ignore the facts. Tasha nodded but said nothing. She knew that justice wasn't always guaranteed, even when the truth was laid bare. All she could do now was wait. When the judge returned, the room fell silent. Everyone leaned forward in their seats, anticipation thick in the air. The judge's expression was stern as she began to speak. After reviewing the evidence and hearing the testimonies, it is clear that the actions of Officer Donovan were not only a gross abuse of power but also a violation of the public trust. This court finds the defendant guilty on all charges. The room erupted. Gasps, cheers, and murmurs filled the space as the weight of the verdict settled over everyone present. Tasha closed her eyes for a moment, a wave of relief washing over her. But it wasn't joy she felt, just a quiet, steady satisfaction. This was one step, one victory, in a much larger battle. Donovan's face was pale, his mouth set in a grim line as officers moved to escort him out of the courtroom. His lawyer spoke in hushed tones, but it was clear that there was little left to say. As he passed by Tasha's seat, he paused, turning to her. "This doesn't change anything," he said, his voice low and bitter. "You think you've won, but you haven't." Tasha met his gaze, her expression calm but unyielding. "It changes everything," she said simply. As Donovan was led away, Barnes placed a hand on Tasha's shoulder. "You did it," he said. "We did it." She nodded, but her mind was already turning to the work that lay ahead. The fight wasn't over, not by a long shot. But for the first time, it felt like progress was possible. And that was enough to keep her moving forward. The months that followed the verdict were a whirlwind of change, accountability, and the slow, steady work of rebuilding. The fallout from the case against Brad Donovan had extended far beyond his conviction. The local police department was placed under federal oversight, its leadership dismantled, and officers with histories of misconduct were either removed or faced investigations of their own. For the first time in years, the community began to feel a glimmer of hope that justice wasn't just a word thrown around in empty speeches but something real, tangible, and within reach. Tasha Miller stood on the steps of City Hall, watching the scene unfold. A crowd had gathered, holding signs that read, "Justice for all," and "Accountability now." The mood was optimistic yet cautious. Years of systemic harm wouldn't be undone overnight, but this was a step. Tasha had been invited to speak at the rally, but for now, she lingered at the edge of the crowd, observing. This wasn't about her, after all. It was about the people who had been ignored for so long, finally finding their voices. Marcus Barnes approached her, holding 2 cups of coffee. "They're waiting for you, you know," he said, handing her one. Tasha smiled faintly, taking the cup. "I know. I don't want this to become about me." "It never was." Barnes gave her a sidelong glance. "It's not about you. But it wouldn't have happened without you either. They need to hear from someone who didn't just talk about justice but fought for it." Tasha sighed, looking at the podium where community leaders were already speaking. "It feels strange," she admitted. "To be standing here when there's still so much work to do." "There's always more work to do," Barnes said. "But that doesn't mean you shouldn't take a moment to recognize what's been accomplished." Finally, Tasha nodded. She set her coffee aside and made her way to the stage. The applause that greeted her was overwhelming, and for a moment, she froze, unsure how to respond. Then she stepped up to the microphone, the words coming to her naturally. "I'm not here to be celebrated," she began, her voice carrying over the crowd. "I'm here because of all of you. Because you refused to stay silent. Because you demanded better. And because together, we showed what's possible when we hold people accountable, not just individuals, but the systems that enable them." The crowd erupted into cheers, and Tasha waited for the noise to settle before continuing. "This isn't the end. It's not even the halfway point. But it's proof that change can happen, and that we all have a role to play in making it happen." Her speech was short, to the point, but it resonated. As she stepped back from the podium, she felt a sense of peace she hadn't allowed herself to feel since this all began. Barnes met her at the base of the stage, clapping her on the back. "See? Told you they needed to hear it." Later that evening, Tasha sat alone in her apartment, finally allowing herself to exhale. She thought about Donovan, not with anger but with a sense of closure. He had been sentenced to several years in prison, and while he had shown no remorse during the trial, his fall from grace had been complete. His name was now synonymous with corruption, and whatever power he'd once wielded was gone. But this wasn't just about Donovan. It was about the officers who had covered for him, the leaders who had enabled him, and the culture that had allowed it all to happen. Many of them were gone now, their careers over, their influence diminished. It wasn't enough to erase the harm they had caused, but it was a start. For Tasha, the resolution wasn't just professional, it was deeply personal. This case had reminded her why she joined the FBI in the first place, to make a difference, to stand up for those who couldn't stand up for themselves. And while the journey had been exhausting, it had reaffirmed her purpose. The next morning, as she prepared for another day of work, she received an email from the Bureau's director. It was brief but meaningful, commending her for her efforts and offering her a new position overseeing a division dedicated to civil rights investigations. It was an opportunity to take the lessons of this case and apply them on a larger scale. Tasha stared at the email for a long moment, a smile slowly spreading across her face. She replied with a single word, "Accepted." The story didn't end with one case, one victory, or even one career. It continued in every choice, every effort to push back against injustice. For Tasha, the fight wasn't over, but she was ready for whatever came next. Reflecting on this journey, it's clear that the battle for justice is never easy. It requires courage, resilience, and a willingness to confront uncomfortable truths. Tasha Miller's story reminds us that accountability is not just about punishing the guilty, it's about creating a system where everyone, regardless of their background, can feel safe, valued, and respected. Now, let's turn this story to you. What did you feel as you listened to this tale? Did it make you think about the importance of standing up for what's right, even when the odds are stacked against you? Justice isn't just a word, it's a choice, one we all have to make, in small and big ways, every day. If this story resonated with you, share your thoughts in the comments. We'd love to hear what you took away from it. And don't forget to subscribe to Tales of Twist for more stories that challenge, inspire, and leave you thinking long after they're over. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next twist-filled tale.